she in her own mind decided she was going to do this. So she phoned up my mother, and she didn't phone up my mother, okay. She decided in her own mind, she's going to do this. And it so happened, I think it was a Sunday anyway, she didn't have any money, she had to borrow a few pounds for the taxi ride to the airport. She threw a few clothes into a suitcase and within 10 minutes was out of her flat. This is a woman who couldn't leave her house to go shopping, without making lists and informing people. And she just left a note for her family saying, "Gone to India." So of course her family thought, she completely flipped. I mean, they knew about Baba, but they weren't Baba lovers. And this is really funny. So my father, meanwhile, he's just doing everything he can to get to India. So Adi and Freni got to the airport, and my father was, the ticket had been arranged, and he was taking his boarding pass and was about to go on the little bus that takes you to the aeroplane. In fact, he was already on the bus. It's wonderful how Delia describes it. Delia, meanwhile, has managed to turn up at the airport, with her eau de cologne and her little suitcase and just going to India. And then found that the airline wouldn't accept her cheque because either they just wouldn't accept a personal cheque. So, of course, meanwhile, Franey is at the airport. I don't know if my father had already gone on the bus. I think the way Delia describes it, he was already on the bus and knew nothing about this. So Franey saw Delia and said, "Delia, what are you doing here?" "I'm going to India." And it so happened that Franey's brother worked for Air India at the time. So through his influence, they kind of guaranteed Delia's cheque. So Delia got her ticket. And what's so funny is I heard my father's version of this story, and then Delia's version is in the book. So my father's on the bus, going to the plane to Baba, and suddenly the bus stops. And there's Delia. And her whole attitude is, "Adi, I've come to be with you." And when she tells a story, it's, he was so broken, he needed me, and I gave him this great comfort, you see. Of course, Baba arranged it. I mean, it had to happen. That these two had to go together. My father was very short-tempered. I mean, with this kind of, he was a real no-nonsense kind of person. So he was confronted with Delia, and immediately she was hysterical because she hated flying. So he told us these great stories of how he just gave her brandy. He basically wanted her knocked out until she got to Ahmednagar. He was just, I have to get this woman, I have to get this lady to Ahmednagar, to the Samadhi. That's my duty, but I'm going to make it easy. And then. The plane stopped in Russia at Moscow airport, and it was, of course it was snowing. I mean, there was snow everywhere, and poor Delia fell and slipped on the ice. And my father she was struggling to get up, and he said, "You get up right now, or I'm going without you." He was on a mission to get to India, so she got up. But interestingly, many years later, Delia had her hip removed and had terrible trouble with the hip, and it was that same side where she fell. But she managed to get up and get on the plane. He gave her more brandies. Then they got to Bombay, and then they got, Sarosh, I suppose, met them, and they had to take a taxi at some point. And you know what driving in India is like, the bumpity bump. Delia also just had to go to the bathroom every 5 minutes. So she sort of, get out her cologne-drenched handkerchief and say, "Oh, Adi, find me a lavatory," And he'd say, "We're in the middle of the Deccan Plateau, what do you expect?" They constantly had to stop, and then she was complaining because she was bumped up and down. So by the time they got to the Samadhi, my father just sort of took her and just gave her to the women mandali, and that was the end of that for him. But what was so wonderful is, he came back and he told this great story, and I mean, he'd just come back from the entombment, and he was able to share this, and even, we laughed and such. And then Delia tells the story, and it's so moving how she tells it, because she really felt she was with him for a purpose. But the best part of the story is that Delia found out many years later she was the only woman, apart from Rano, who was living there, the only Western woman, Mandali, to be there at the entombment. And the most improbable, absolutely the most improbable. And she found out many years later that Baba had said, "Delia will be with me at the end." And it's just so sweet how, she went with my father, because the family connection, my family and Delia, is very, very strong. And so it was just somehow so right that they should go together. So that's one story I wanted to tell. And then I thought I would just tell a little bit here and there about what it was like growing up as part of Baba's family in England. It was interesting. and not easy, as I said, and definitely not what you call a normal family situation. One of the byproducts, I suppose, of being Baba's family in the West was that, of course, people were very interested to meet us, Baba lovers, because my father was Baba's brother, and to meet someone like him outside of India was really quite an opportunity. So it meant that we had a constant stream of Baba lovers coming through our house, really pretty much from when Baba dropped his body. And people started going to India, Americans especially, started going to India via London because it was cheaper at the time. And they'd stay at our house, and they'd stay, and some of them never left, and some of them, came back, and otherwise we had to ask to leave. But it was a wonderful time for me because, to be honest, I don't think there was ever a period where there wasn't ever someone else in my house, somebody else staying. And we had lodgers. I met many of my best friends, and I met my husband, Jay. I mean, he came through when I was 14. So that was a wonderful part of being Baba's family in the West, which I'm going to talk about more on Sunday. One nice thing that happened, it didn't last very long, but after Baba dropped his body, we started having meetings at our house every Friday, because he dropped his body on a Friday. The last Friday of the month. And for a while it was really nice, and there'd be a gathering of people, and then it sort of fell apart. This was the early days of the new generation of the English Baba group. And people were very enthusiastic and very new. But it was the beginning of a special time and a renewal for Delia, who at this point was in her 60s, I guess, and early 70s. And, she loved young people, and she still loves young people, and she's very interested in the arts. So all these, like Pete Townsend came to Baba around that time, and just young London scene hippies. I mean, Delia really liked this. She thought this was great. And the Baba Centre took off, and Oceanic. But I'm going to talk about that later. So really, if anyone has any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. What I'm trying to say is that a lot of my feeling for Baba, I think my father's responsible for. And a lot of my understanding for Baba, limited though it is, my father was responsible for. And I was very, very close to him. And my father was incredibly intuitive. It was sort of known in the family, Mani used to say how intuitive, to the point where he didn't do it as a prediction at all, but he would just say something and it would happen. He knew, and he knew when I was pregnant and this kind of thing. And he would say things to people coming through the house. So when my father died, it was a great loss for me and for my, my daughter, but it was Baba's timing, so.
And to broaden a bit more about Adi, do you have a story that comes to mind about his conviction in his love for Baba?
Well, yes. Well, it was more my impressions are just how he was. You met him. He was extraordinary, and he wasn't everyone's typical idea of what Baba's brother would be like or should be like. And many people were startled by him, but many people who came through our house were just astounded by his love. That was always the central impression that people came away with. And my father, as I say, didn't act in the typical, he was not saintly, or sanctimonious. But throughout my childhood, I was often amazed at just this love, for Baba, and I just always sensed there was a lot more than any of us could see that was going on. But one thing he was really good at, my father was, if any of you've met him, was incredibly direct. He didn't care what anybody thought. He just said what he felt. And I've always been a bit sort of weedy about telling people about Baba. I do say, but I don't tell any lies or anything, but we all have our little guru master, whatever, depending on the circumstance. I always say it in the end, but I've often wished I had a little bit more conviction when I'm saying it. I think it's partly because, I'm related. It's one thing to say you follow somebody who is God, but it's another thing to say, and I happen to be his niece. That's it. But my father, on the other hand, who was his brother, just was so powerful in the way he'd say it, and we lived, I should say, it was really strange I mean, we lived in a very sort of conservative, gentrified, very pleasant suburb of London. And I grew up and I was very, very happy. And about 3 houses, the length of 3 houses to the left of us was a church. And about 3 houses to the right of us was the vicarage. We lived in Church of England territory. And, you know, on Barbara's birthday, we'd put Barbara's flag out every year. And Barbara's photo was in our window. And actually, one priest, one of the vicars, was really interested in Barbara, and then he was promptly sort of excommunicated. We never heard from him, but he was excommunicated. I mean, he went under a cloud. So, you know, I'm sure Barbara was up to something. But we lived in this, and you know, it's England. You'll repeat it again, but my parents wanted to go to America, and Barbara said, no, England. You know, this very conservative, sort of stodgy, like you described, stodgy place. At that time, England changed. You know, when Delia and Margaret Crask and Kitty came to Barbara and were interested, there was a completely different feeling in England. I mean, I wasn't there, but that's what they say and what people say, that England in the 30s and 40s, there was a real interest in spirituality, but now it's just very bland. So, you know, my father, who's sort of a controversial figure anyway, I mean, he's, you know, this fiery kind of personality, is plonked in this little suburb with his family. And, of course, people will come in our house, you know, some people show their devotion to Barbara in different ways. I don't mean, I'm not talking about internally, but, you know, some people just have a tasteful black and white photo in their house. You know, we have everywhere, it's a shrine. So you can't miss Barbara when you come into our house. So, you know, people will come in, and sometimes they'd be, you know, the bank manager or the vicar, you know, or the insurance person or whoever. And they would, not too often because this was England, but generally they would ask about Barbara. And my father would just sit right down and tell them exactly. He'd say, you know, Mayor Barbara, avatar of the age, God in human form. How do you know about him? I'm his brother. But, you know, I don't think, and I used to be with my father a lot. I mean, when he would see people, I'd kind of be there. And I don't think I ever saw anybody flinch. Or, you know, the very least they would display would just be polite acceptance of what my father thought, not acceptance that Barbara is God necessarily. And then at most there would be interest. But it was just the way he said it, without any guile, you know, or any sort of hang-ups whatsoever. And I remember one time somebody saying to him, well, how do you know he's God? How do you know he's God? And I don't know if I should quote this. My father said, well, you know, I don't know. He said, I don't know. He could be God or the devil, but I believe in him. And it was just so powerful when he said that. And this person was just, oh. But that, you know, that's what he was like. And you met him, so you know. Yes.
How do you bring Barbara with your own children in your relationship?
With my daughter? Just, I mean, to be honest with you, there's not even much thought behind it. You know, she's grown up all along knowing who he is. And she's at that age, of course, where she's very innocent, so, you know, her mind's not working too much, but, you know, she does say things like, well, why am I related to him? And why doesn't my friend follow Barbara? And I mean, she has made announcements that are incredibly embarrassing. You know, once in a car where I couldn't do anything, and we were sort of very good friends from school, and they're devout Catholics. And Mara just said something about... well, my mother had an experience with Barbara, which I'll let her tell you, but Mara, you know, came out with this and said, my granny's seen God. And, you know, my friend Carmen sort of, the foot was going on the brake. And I just quickly, I don't know, I said, no, I know, Mara, she said that, and then Mara said something like, Barbara is my uncle, isn't he? And I said, and she said, he is, isn't he, Mummy? And I said, yes, and because she'd obviously told a friend of hers that that this was the case. And this friend had said, of course, you know, what are you talking about? We live in a sort of fundamentalist land. It's like we've gone from Church of England to the fundamentalists of Albuquerque. And so she told her best friend, you know, the parents go to church all the time. And I said something feeble, like, oh, yes, we're all God's children, or something like that, you know. So, but, you know, we're telling her that, basically, that people just aren't going to understand, and that, you know, there's that fine line between sharing Barbara and not at all feeling inhibited, and also just being sensitive to what people are going to think. I mean, I don't know. I there's no answer really for that one. It's, there's just a sort of period where it's a little awkward. I mean, I went through it. I'm sure there are people here who've been through it, and then you come out the other end. And I mean, now I just say it. I don't have any. I mean, I think that also the thing about being related is, of course, that's the ego getting in the way. But I used to feel very self-conscious about that. But really, that's nothing to do with anything, So she'll be fine. She's very bright, I think. That'll be okay.
Are you telling the other jokes later?
The penguins?
I remember the one about the nun. Okay. Save the time. I just have to think for a second, because it's awful not to get the punchline right. Okay. This is set in Ireland again. A man went into a pub, like a bar, to get a pint of Guinness. And as he was going in, a nun appeared sort of at the door. She was at the threshold, and she said to him, "Oh, my son," she said, "What kind of establishment is this?" And he said, "Oh, it's a pub, sister. It's somewhere I'm going to meet my friends." And she said, "Oh, what is a pub, brother?" And he said, "Oh, it's a place where beverages are served." And he was feeling a little bit sort of embarrassed, because she was obviously this saintly nun. And she said, "Oh, what kind of beverages, brother?" And he said, "Oh, alcohol." And she said, "Oh, alcohol." She said, "Oh, I never touch it." And he said, "Oh, well, I'm afraid I do, I like to have my drink." She said, "Oh, no, you should know, it's very bad for you." And he said, "Well, sister," he said, "have you actually ever had anything yourself?" She said, "Well, no, I haven't. I have to say, I've never tasted spirits." And he said, "Well, let me just take you in and buy you a drink, and you just taste it and tell me if it's really so bad." And she said, "Well, you're right." She said, "You're right. In God's eyes, everything, I shouldn't judge you just because you're drinking when I haven't done it myself." This is really silly, but Barbara liked it. I have to laugh. So they went in, and she was very kind of embarrassed. She said, "Oh, I think I'll just stay at the back, He said, "No, come forward. It's a family place." And he said, "Well, do you know what kind of drinks are around?" She said, "Oh, yes, I have. I've heard of beer, and I've heard of wine, and isn't there something called gin?" And he said, "Yes, there's a drink called gin." He said, "Actually, it's a lady's drink, and it doesn't taste too strong. You'll probably like that." So he said, let me buy you a small drink of gin." And she said, "Oh, don't you sometimes put lemon in it, or some tonic water? I've heard you put tonic. It's medicinal." He said, "Oh, yes, you do put tonic in. That's not a bad suggestion." So he said, "Okay, you just sit here, and I'll go up to the bar and order you a drink." And he was just about to go up, and she said, "Oh, brother," she said, "I think you better ask for it in a teacup, because it wouldn't do, would it, for people to see that, a nun's drink. He said, "Put it in a teacup, and they'll think I'm drinking tea." So he said, "Okay, yeah, bless you," all this kind of. So he went up, and he said, "Well, can I have like a triple vodka for myself?" And he said, "And I'd like a gin and tonic." And he said, "Oh, and by the way, could you put it in a teacup, please?" And the barman said, "Oh, absolutely sure." He said, the nun's back again, is she?" It's much better with an Irish accent. And I don't remember the third one. There were three that I just kept, repeat. The third one was to do with the driving test, but I don't remember that. I'm afraid so.
I have a question. You used the word ego before, and what I read about, I've often wondered what you thought about certain minds, and the first one that comes to me is Freud. Do you have any ideas on Freud or Marx?
Not that I know of. I'm not the best person to ask those kinds of questions of, because I'm really quite, as I say, because of the order about not reading his books and such, I've tended to, I have read the biographies, but I've tended to shy away from that. I just haven't wanted to trip myself up. But I do know that Jung really wanted to meet Baba. And as I understand it, at the time, Baba was interested in meeting him. But interestingly, what happened was that they never met. But Baba asked my father to correspond with Jung, and they had a lengthy correspondence, just trying to arrange when and where Jung and Baba could meet. And I don't know how long the correspondence went on for, but quite a while. And then nothing ever came of it. And that always interested me, because my father was really quite analytical, and it just seemed it was some kind of exercise for him. But I don't know. I mean, this is a very sort of general blanket statement that is a little bit related to what you're asking. And don't quote me. But when I was about to apply to university, it's slightly different in England. You basically choose one subject. It's not like you do all this major and all these other subjects. You choose one subject, and that's what you study for 3 or 4 years. It's really tough. It's kind of like, I think an English BA is like the equivalent of an American MA. So an English person with a BA can get a job here that would require an American MA. Anyway, so I had become really interested in child psychology. I always loved children. And I don't know, maybe when I was about 16, I developed this interest in psychology and started reading loads of books. And I read a lot of Freud and just everything that was out there. And then I applied to university, to 5 universities to study psychology. And of course, all along, Mera and Money were being informed of all of this in India, about what I was going to do next. And I just got sort of supportive letters back, but nothing really specific. And it's a bit of a long story, but anyway, I never did study psychology, and I studied Italian instead, which could not be, further removed. But what happened was, in order to apply at university in England, you sort of fill out your application with your exam qualifications and such. And I was always arts biased. I had no sciences whatsoever. And also you had to write something. And everything I wrote was just very sort of biased towards the arts. I just didn't have that kind of analytical scientific mind. So even though I got the interviews because they liked what I wrote, each person at each university, each professor said, Miss Irani, you're really barking up the wrong tree. You should be in an arts program because that's where your talents lie. So anyway, it was like at the 11th hour that I backed out of psychology and studied Italian, and that was just by fluke. It was just by fluke. I had a qualification which allowed me to study Italian at university, and it turned out to be the best thing that ever happened. I had 4 really wonderful years. I lived in Italy for a year. Anyway, when that decision had been made, and it was all to do with me, and I wrote Money wrote back to me. And this is just to me. I'm not trying to make some kind of general statement at all, but this is just to me. She wrote back and said, I'm so glad that you're not studying psychology and you're studying Italian. She said, Baba loved Italy, and of course, as we know. And then he said, I know he wouldn't have liked it if you had studied psychology. And, make of that what you will. I mean, that's what... So I felt very much that I had sort of been saved from taking that route. I'm not trying to say anything bad about psychology, but that was, maybe just for Baba's family it wasn't appropriate or whatever. So, yeah.
What impressions did you have of your grandfather?
5 more minutes. Pardon?
What impressions did you have of your grandfather? Baba's
father? I mean, not, apart from the stories, not very much, because of course he died many, many years. Just his sense of devotion and searching. I don't really have much of a sense of him, I have to say. I feel I know my grandmother a little bit more, though I never met her either. So. Hi.
Was John Stevens very much involved in your family at that time?
So on and off. I mean, not more when Baba was in the body, and then Don, started his own group, his God Speaks group, and The London Barber group is quite fractured, and there are just little groups. So Don had his group, and of course, he's very, very good at analysing Barber's works and that kind of thing. So we just knew him more as kind of a family friend. But no, we didn't really we didn't really go to any of the Barber meetings in London. So we just knew him more as a family friend. But he definitely was on the London scene. But then he fairly quickly established his own group, which attracted the kind of people, who wanted to really study God Speaks or whatever. And he's in France now, I think. He's based in France.
So in Adi, I remember when I was there, he spoke in Farsi, Hafiz. And it was so rich and deep, whatever he was saying. And I'd be able to spirit out a little bit of what he was saying, even though I don't know Farsi.
Yeah.
And then he'd pull it together by giving the English translation.
You don't ask me to do that, because I always regretted that I never learnt Persian. Well, yes, because he could, he spoke classical Farsi, and I've foolishly, I never wanted to learn, but he loved Hafiz, and we were saying at one point he memorized just about everything he ever wrote. My father was one of these people who, he read a book a day, and he'd do the crossword puzzle in 2 minutes. It was that, I don't know, but he didn't continue with his education. He had to leave college early because he travelled with Baba when he was very young. And in fact, he was so young that that's why my father had 2 birthdays, because Baba adulterated his passport so that he could actually get a passport. I forget, but anyway, my father was born July 10th, Silence Day, so we always celebrated his birthday in silence. But his second birthday was September 18th, which Baba gave him. So he had 2 birthdays. But he was, even though he didn't continue with that formal education, he was really the most educated person I'd ever met.
And then did he speak? Do you remember him often just reciting?
Oh yes, he would recite, and he would sing, and he played the tablas, and he would just come out with all these stories, and in his memory. I mean, it was really amazing, because I never actually saw him studying this. I used to see him reading fiction. I mean, he read books all the time, but I never saw him with his copy of Hafiz. And this was many, many years before that he'd learnt all this. But and especially as he grew older, and he would reminisce more and more about Baba and their young days, he would be reminded of the couplets and such.
Were there any periods in your growing up where you had the conflict of what Baba wants versus what you want, besides cutting your hair? Any other?
Not really. No. I mean, there were. No. There were. Basically, I never really wanted to do any of the stuff that Baba wouldn't have wanted me. I don't mean to say I was not. I was naughty. I went through a really rebellious stage. I know I gave my mother a lot of worry, but basically, there wasn't a conflict. I would have chosen to do what I did anyway, I think. And I also had my father. I mean, he would have. I didn't have much rope. I mean, he gave me just enough, but it was very much just in me. I mean, I really have to thank both my parents for that they just gave that, and there's no question, no questions asked. I knew exactly what was expected of me, and so consequently they really trusted me. But no. Shireen, yeah.
Of all the really intriguing figures around Baba, your father is one of the least documented. Did he leave any autobiographical notes, or is there a body of tape recordings of his reminiscences?
Well, my father was always quite reluctant. Many, of course, people ask that of him a lot. David Fenster in India has got some tapes, I think, and some notes. And I think my father, is. I mean, obviously he's there in Bao's biographies, but a lot of that has to do, of course, with the fact that he was in the West. I mean, he was the only member of Baba's family to be separate from him in that sense. But no, there's nothing. Maybe I'll do it one day. I mean. there's nothing really written down just about him. And in fact, an interesting thing happened to me since coming to the Sahavas. Last night I was thinking about what I was going to say the next 2 times I talk. And it struck me that I've never really spoken about my father before. Whenever I've given a talk, it's always been about my times with Baba, of course, that's what's uppermost. But as time goes on, and it's been 4 years since my father died, I just have the feeling that I'm going to talk about him more. Because of who he was.
Both of you could, in fact, contribute to that thinking now.
A little bit, yeah. Oh, at the panel tonight, yes.
No, I mean just in print or...
Oh, I see, yes, definitely.
Your mother.
Yeah. Yes.
Shireen,
I have
you
to
come
stop.
from a background of arranged marriages. How did the marriage happen between you and Jay?
Oh, this is a great story, but shall I can't tell it, they're telling me. But I was going to talk about this at my talk on
Well, good.
Sunday. It's a really good story. But I will tell you this, that without question, I'm not sort of the kind of person, I'm not given to, I don't have visions, and I often feel jealous of people who, I'm intuitive, but I don't, it's pretty solid with me and Baba, but one thing I'm absolutely certain about is that Baba definitely arranged my marriage. I feel that very strongly. And moreover, that what really was just so incredible, because I could see it happening, was that my father knew that Jay and I were going to get married, and he knew that when I was 14. And that I will, on my life, swear, that I know. So I don't normally make statements like that, but this I absolutely categorically know. It's a really good story. I like telling it. So please ask me it again on Sunday. But is that? I shouldn't tell it now. Is that right? Okay. Jai Baba.